As you have not met the profit quota, your performance has been deemed below standard. Welcome to our disciplinary process.
Welcome to your first day on the job. This is your very own autopilot ship, where you will eat and sleep for the duration of your contract. Make yourself at home. To complete the onboarding process, you will want to check the instruction manual and sign into your ship's computer terminal. We trust you will be a great asset to the company. Great asset to the company. Great asset to the company. Great asset.
you should wire the
As
positive
you have not
terminal.
met the profit quota, your performance has been deemed below standard. Welcome to our disciplinary process.
Welcome to your first day on the job. This is your very own autopilot ship, where you will eat and sleep for the duration of your contract. Make yourself at home. To complete the onboarding process, you will want to check the instruction manual and sign into your ship's computer terminal. We trust you will be a great asset to the company. Great asset to the company. Great asset to the company. Asset to great asset.
Procure por 4K. Eu tenho certeza que você vai ter uma melhor experiência. Esse é um vídeo bem diferente e eu espero que vocês curtam. Mas e aí? Já colocou em 4K? A imagem tá bem bonita? Então bora lá.
Here in the United States and in many other places around the world, there are two dominant political parties. And it's not so good. The question is, if everyone hates two-party systems, why are they so common? Well, one big reason is the voting system most of us use. So in this video, we're gonna simulate some elections to see why plurality is so bad, and we'll also look at two better voting systems. Okay, so here are the three voting systems we're gonna look at. First, there's plurality voting, where every voter votes for exactly one candidate. This is also called first past the post. I'm honestly not quite sure why it's called that, but apparently it's a reference to horse racing. Second, we have instant runoff voting, sometimes called ranked choice voting, where each voter ranks the candidates from best to worst, and then those rankings are used to eliminate one candidate at a time. And finally, there's approval voting, where each voter can vote for as many candidates as they want. Each of these systems will have a flaw and a voting strategy related to that flaw, and we'll fill those in as we go. These are all voting systems that choose one winner. There are also systems that select multiple winners, and those, frankly, are way better. Really just because they don't try to collapse a bunch of different preferences into one single outcome. We might talk about multi-winner systems in a future video, but for now we're going to focus on these single winner methods, since multi-winner elections aren't always an option without restructuring the government, which I guess is hard. But okay, before we dive into the specifics of these methods, let's talk about how we're going to model the voters' preferences. One way to do it, which is pretty common, is to put everything on a one-dimensional left-to-right spectrum. In this model, each candidate and each voter would sit at some position on this line that represents their views. Now, obviously this is much, much simpler than the real world, since all possible issues are just collapsed into one line. We can do a little bit better by using a two-dimensional issue space. This is still a lot simpler than real life, but it at least allows a voter to agree with the candidate on one issue but disagree on another. And it gives political parties more ways to vary from each other. And just for fun, we can be specific about what these two issues are in this nation of blobs. One issue is whether the government should focus on promoting the production of apples or mangoes, and the other is whether blob homes should be these cute, modern-looking homes, or these wacky, spooky, curvy ones. A candidate positioned right here would be pretty strongly in favor of mangoes and modern-looking homes, and a candidate down here would be somewhat in favor of spooky, curvy homes and slightly in favor of apples. Each time we set up an election scenario, we'll place a few colorful candidate blobs, and we'll also place 100 gray blobs throughout this issue space as voters. Okay, so now we can look at the plurality system. This is the one where each voter votes for exactly one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes, or the plurality, wins. Alright, let's run our first election. In this case, orange beats green. Great. This system works just fine when there are only two candidates or parties. And sure, there will be some disagreement, but it's hard to think of anything that could be more fair than just seeing who most voters prefer. But now let's add a third purple candidate. What do you think will happen in this case? Well, let's see. With purple in the mix, green ends up winning instead of orange. If you live in a place with a two-party system, you probably saw that coming. This result is a bit weird. Purple joined the race just to get last place, but they still changed the winner. Orange voters are going to be mad about that, and even most purple voters would have preferred orange over green. This is called the spoiler effect. So these purple voters are presented with a difficult choice. Do they vote for their honest favorite, leaving the choice to others? Or do they strategically vote for their second choice, hoping to get an outcome they prefer? The argument for voting honestly is that you need to do this if your favorite party is going to have a chance at building more support over time to eventually win. But that'll mean throwing a lot of elections to your least favorite party over time. It's really hard to ignore the tangible, immediate stakes in any given election, so it turns out that most people don't even consider third parties. And the two major parties mostly just need to worry about each other in a zero-sum game. Just look at how complacent they are. Anywho, now let's see how these other ones behave. Next we have instant runoff voting, where each voter ranks the candidates from most to least favorite. A runoff system is a series of elections, each one narrowing the list of candidates until a winner is found. And with instant runoff voting, we use the voters' rankings to do the runoff instantly. So that's where the name comes from. As an example, let's step through the process using the same set of voters and candidates we used before. Step 1 is to see how many times each candidate was ranked as the first choice. Notice how these are the same totals as in the honest plurality election. And if this were a plurality election, we'd be done. But in instant runoff, we eliminate the candidate in last place and then run the election again, this time counting the second choices of the purple voters. And this process can be repeated as many times as needed, depending how many candidates there are. And now, these are the same final totals we saw in the plurality elections when the voters were strategic. So one way to think about it is that instant runoff voting allows voters to vote honestly, but if their favorite candidate ends up getting last anyway, they can fall back on being strategic with their second favorite. Pretty nice, honestly. Now you might be thinking, we fixed the spoiler effect. There's no longer a conflict between honesty and strategy. Instant runoff forever. And in some cases, that's true. But there are still some situations where something weird happens, once again forcing some voters to make that difficult choice between honesty and strategy. Before we go through an example of that together, try pausing the video to see if you can find a situation yourself. Okay, so if we arrange the candidates like this, we're gonna get a weird result. So let's see how that works. First, let's run without purple just to see the baseline results. Okay, orange beats green just like before. But now let's add purple back in and see what happens. Purple ends up doing well enough to pass the first round, but by doing so, it knocks orange out of the race, and in the end, green wins. If the purple voters had instead put orange first, orange would have made it through the first round and then beaten green in the final round. And the purple voters like orange better. It boils down to the same situation as the spoiler effect from before. Instant runoff elections are in danger of running into this kind of situation when the three parties are roughly on a line with one party between two other reasonably popular parties. So it's called the center squeeze phenomenon, and here orange is in danger of being squeezed out. And with how much we like to discuss political issues on that one-dimensional left-to-right spectrum, this situation honestly doesn't seem too unlikely to me. Now, you might be wondering how this would work in real life. Great empirical thinking. Well, we unfortunately don't have too many examples, but Australia has been using instant runoff for over a century now. On the question of party choice, it does seem to be a bit better than the United States, with several parties that manage to have some national representation. But they do still have two dominant parties, as you might expect from this center squeeze phenomenon. So we shouldn't see instant runoff voting as a silver bullet for our democracy, but all this said, it is way better than plurality voting, where you're almost always incentivized to ignore everyone but the two most popular parties. Alright, the final system we're going to talk about is approval voting. Compared to instant runoff voting, approval is pretty simple. Instead of just voting for one candidate, you can vote for as many as you like. For this method, we need to define an approval range. It'll be this big. If a candidate is within this distance of a voter, the voter will approve of that candidate. Otherwise, it won't approve. And it'll be easier to visualize if we draw the circles around the candidates, so let's do that. Now, all the voters within these candidate circles will vote for that candidate. Okay, with that in place, once again, we'll try it first with just orange and green. Okay, again, it turns out that orange wins a head-to-head with green. And now let's add purple and see how it goes. Hey look, orange still wins. No spoiler effect this time. And not only that, but vote totals for orange and green didn't change at all. Voters could approve or disapprove of purple without needing to change whether they approve of orange or green. And this would be the case no matter how the candidates were arranged. With approval voting, it turns out that as long as everyone is voting honestly, a new candidate can only change the outcome of the election by winning it, which is a pretty nice feature. But you may have noticed that I said, as long as everyone is voting honestly. Even though approval voting doesn't have the same kind of spoiler effect as plurality voting had and instant runoff sometimes had, there are still some reasons for voters to be strategic about their votes. Again, before we go through it together, pause and try to figure out what you might do if you were in the position of some of these voters. Okay, there are actually a few layers of strategy. First, approving all three candidates has the same effect as not voting at all. So voters that honestly approve of all three should strategically disapprove of their least favorite candidate, making it more likely that one of their two favorites can win. When we redo the election with the voters following this rule, these are the voters who approve of all three, so they'll strategically cut out their least favorite. And purple actually comes out ahead now. This isn't the best, since fewer voters genuinely approve of the outcome, but it's also not the worst, since purple and orange are so near each other, and everyone still got to be honest about their first choice. But still, not the best. And now there's a second layer of strategy that involves noticing that purple and orange have very similar totals, and both are significantly ahead of green. Out of the voters that approve of both orange and purple, every voter has a favorite of the two. If two of those voters who like orange more decide to strategically betray purple, they can make orange win. But then, if two other voters who like purple best strategically betray orange, then purple wins again. So now purple and orange both have lower totals, but green's total is the same. But the orange voters still want to win, so they betray some more. And then Team Purple betrays some more. And so on. And green keeps getting closer and closer to winning. Of course, the purple and orange voters wouldn't purposely hand the election to green, but since the election happens all at once, they have to decide ahead of time how much to betray each other. Each side can win by out-betraying the other side. But if they both go too far, green will win, and they'll both be sad. I mean, green will be happy, but purple and orange will be sad. This is called the chicken dilemma, because they're kind of seeing which one chickens out. And it has a similar structure to the hawk-dove game from game theory, which I have another video about if you want to check it out. So if we take this chicken dilemma to its extreme conclusion, everyone just votes for their favorite and nobody else, which is basically just the plurality system. But I think it's still worth noting that even in the case with rampant strategic voting, no voter ever had a reason not to approve of its actual favorite. All the strategizing was around the second or third favorites, so that's still a nice feature. Before we go back to look at all of the systems together, there are a few more things to say about approval voting. First, approval voting is a special case of a category of voting systems called score voting or range voting systems. Approval voting basically lets you score each candidate on a range of 0 or 1, but some systems let you assign a score from a different range, like from 1 to 10 or from A to F if you like letter grades. And finally, we should also talk about real-world examples. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any examples that were long-lasting and well-documented, at least for governments, so I'm not sure we can really say anything too definitive about approval voting without giving it a little bit more of a try. Okay, so now that we've looked at all three, what can we say? Well, none of the systems are perfect, but we can say that it's pretty clear that plurality voting is the worst. It's just bad. But as far as the other two go, it's hard to say which is better without more real-world examples. One nice thing about instant runoff is that it's the second most common single winner voting method, so it might have the best chance of actually replacing plurality. On the other hand, I do tend to like approval, because voters can always be honest about their first choice. Whether you're very aggressive and greedy with your vote, or you're very willing to compromise and vote for your second favorite, you can always vote for your first choice. Which I find really convincing, if you can't tell. But in the end, I'd happily take either one of these over plurality voting. Because again, plurality voting is bad. But having said that, even though that system sucks, it's still much better than nothing. So vote every time you get the chance. As always, thanks for watching. And again, vote every time you get the chance. This video is about genes that gamble. The basic idea of natural selection is that if a gene does an above-average job at helping its host creatures survive and reproduce, it'll tend to become more common as creatures compete with each other over the generations. This tendency to survive and reproduce is called fitness, and you'll often hear natural selection summarized as survival of the fittest. But one day, a clever, newly mutated gene realized another strategy was possible. If copies of the gene exist in multiple different creatures, the gene can do better by causing the creatures to help each other rather than mercilessly competing with each other. This concept is known as inclusive fitness. The only problem is the copies of a gene are hidden inside the creatures and they can't see each other. So if the copies of the gene want to help each other, they have to gamble, sometimes helping the competing genes by accident. So the question is, how can a gene strategize around inclusive fitness without the whole plan backfiring? The condition for making inclusive fitness gambling work is called Hamilton's rule, and that's what we're going to build to. It's a pretty simple looking inequality, and if you've learned about Hamilton's rule before, you might be wondering why the heck this video is so long. Well, it turns out that the simplicity of Hamilton's rule is a bit deceptive, or at least it deceived me at first. So this video is going to go slowly, starting with the general requirement for gambling to be beneficial, and then applying that idea to simulations of increasingly complex biological systems. As we build, something will go wrong. And when it does, you might not realize it. You might be deceived, just like I was. It'll get fixed before the end of the video, but consider it a challenge to follow closely enough to see what's going wrong before I tell you about it. So let's start by playing a game. It costs 1 coin to play, then you can roll a die. If it comes up 6, you win 7 coins. Otherwise, you get nothing. Let's let this blob play for a bit while we try to predict what will happen. Okay, so there are 6 possible outcomes, and we can summarize each with an equation where the payout minus the cost equals the net gain. If the die lands on a number from 1 to 5, the payout is 0 and the cost is 1. leading to a net gain of -1 in each case, or a loss of 1 if you prefer to say it that way. If the die lands on a 6, though, the payout is 7, so the net gain for that case is 6. On a fair die, these 6 possible results are all equally likely, so we can combine the equations together and divide everything by 6 to get the average payout, cost, and net gain. One way to read this equation is to say you have a 1 in 6 chance to win the benefit of 7 coins, and it costs 1 coin to play, so you expect to win 1/6 of the coin per time you play. The coins only come in whole numbers, but the average is a fraction. An average predicted result like this has a special name. It's called an expected value. And since the expected value here is positive, the blob should gain money over time by continuing to play. It looks like the blob is actually doing way better than 1/6 of a coin on average. That's good for the blob, but not so good for our prediction. It's only been a few rolls though, so maybe the blob is just getting lucky. If our prediction is good, it should start to look more accurate with a larger number of rolls. So let's enlist some more blobs to see if that happens. Well, it's starting to get pretty close. It can sometimes take surprisingly long for random events to even out, which is my favorite excuse whenever I'm getting my butt kicked in a board game. We can use variables to write this out in a way that will apply to a broader set of situations. The benefit of winning times the probability of winning minus the cost to play is the expected value of a gambling game. If the expected value is positive, it's usually a good idea to gamble. And when the expected value is negative, like in every single casino game for example, you should expect to lose money. You might notice that this looks basically the same as Hamilton's rule already, so let's try applying it to a biology simulation to see how it works. We'll start with the same basic structure from the video on green beard altruism. Each day, blobs will go out to the forest to eat some fruit. Some of the trees have predators in them though, and if the blobs are unlucky enough to visit a tree with a predator in it, they'll get eaten. But if they don't get eaten, they'll head to one of the homes and reproduce, creating a puddle of 3 new identical blobs in their place. And yes, a group of blob siblings is officially called a puddle. And after the blobs reproduce, the cycle repeats. Also, when it's time to go home, there might not be enough homes to go around, in which case some randomly determined blobs won't get to go home and reproduce. In case you've seen that green beard video, I want to highlight the key difference here. This time, the siblings always stick together in their puddle when they go out to a tree. There's no altruism yet, but let's make this a bit bigger and let it run for a while to understand how the simulation works in this baseline case. Alright, it turns out that the blobs thrive in this environment, and the limiting factor ends up being the supply of houses. The blobs should really figure out a way to build more housing, but comments like that belong in the economics series. Okay, now let's add the ability to be altruistic. Again, this will be pretty similar to what we saw in the green beard video. When the blobs go to a tree with a predator in it, one of them will notice the predator, and it'll have 2 options for how to react. The first option is to just run away, leaving the other blobs to die. We'll call this the cowardly behavior. The second option will be to make a bunch of noise to warn the other blobs, but in the process attract the predator's attention and end up getting eaten. Because these blobs are sacrificing themselves to help others, we'll call this the altruistic behavior. The behavior will be controlled by a gene, which has 2 versions or alleles. The cowardly allele will be blue, and the altruism allele will be orange. The blobs can't actually see the genes, but we're going to use these colors to graph the frequency of each allele over time. I mention this in basically every video, but I can't say enough how in real life the cause of behaviors is very complex. It's only partly genetic, and the genetic part itself is a lot more complicated than this model we're using here, where just one gene controls this one kind of behavior. We're just using a simple model to explore one small piece of the very large picture of behavior. But with that said, let's run this simulation. We'll start with equal numbers of each allele. Before we hit go though, what do you think will happen? Will one allele take over? If so, which one? Try using that expected value idea we talked about earlier, and keep in mind that the puddles stay together when they go to find food. This graph shows the frequencies of each allele over time stacked on top of each other. At the beginning, it's half and half, but over time, the orange altruism allele drove the other allele to extinction. Let's see if we can make sense of why the altruism allele did so well. Just like before, we'll look at the benefit of the behavior times the probability of getting the benefit minus the cost of the behavior to get the expected value. But instead of coins, we're worried about copies of the altruism allele. The blob that notices the predator could have survived, but instead sacrifices itself, destroying one copy of the altruism allele. So the cost of the altruistic behavior is 1. And the benefit is that 2 sibling blobs live when otherwise they would have died. And since they're genetically identical, there's a 100% chance that the siblings have the altruism allele. So the probability P of getting the benefit is 1. And the expected value is a gain of 1 copy of the altruism allele. It's kind of weird to look at this and see a gain when one of the blobs dies, but we're comparing the effect of the altruistic behavior to the effect of the other option, which is just running away and leaving both siblings to die. A predator attacking is always bad, but it's less bad for the altruism allele because there are 2 survivors instead of 1. So that all seems to make sense. But we should do more runs to check that we didn't just fool ourselves with one unluckily unlikely simulation. It does happen. In science, you gotta try to prove yourself wrong. This graph summarizes all 30 runs. Each thin black line is 1 run, and the thick black line is the average. So yeah, the orange altruism allele takes over the population pretty consistently. In hindsight, that's not too surprising. There's only one possible outcome with the altruistic behavior, and it's positive for the allele, so it's not even really a gamble. Now let's make it more interesting by adding sexual reproduction to mix up the alleles and add uncertainty. Now when creatures go home at the end of the day, 2 creatures will go to each home. And when they produce their puddle of 3 offspring together, each offspring will get a copy of one of the parent's alleles, with each parent having an equal chance of passing to each offspring. If you've learned about genetics before, you might have learned about creatures that have 2 alleles for each gene in their genome instead of just 1. And in that case, each offspring gets 1 allele from each parent. The word for that is diploid. That's how humans and most other animals work, but some organisms do have just 1 copy. The word for that is haploid, and at least for now, we're gonna stick with that. Okay, for this simulation, let's make our prediction together. Just like in the previous simulation, sounding the alarm will cost a blob its life, and cost the altruism allele one of its copies. And the benefit is still 2, since 2 blobs will be saved. But it's no longer certain that the siblings will also carry the altruism allele. The sexual reproduction is mixing up the alleles, so P is no longer equal to 1 like it was with asexual reproduction. At the other extreme, if P were all the way down to 0, both siblings would definitely not share the allele, and the expected net value to the allele would be -1. But realistically, it'll be somewhere in between. So to figure out the value of P here, let's bring back the sacrificer blob and focus on just 1 sibling. We're already in a situation where the blob who notices the predator has the altruism allele, so we know that at least one of the parents also has the allele. That's where the sacrificer's allele came from. The sibling could have gotten its allele from that same parent or the other parent. Each possibility is equally likely, each happening 50% of the time. When both siblings get the allele from the same parent, we have a special name for it. The 2 alleles are identical by descent. In this case, the sibling definitely has the altruism allele. So let's put that 50% chance into the value for P, but we're not done yet. In the other possibility, where the sibling got its allele from the other parent, it could be either kind of allele. Since the mating is random, the chance that the other parent also had the altruism allele is the same as the frequency of the altruism allele in the whole population. But that number is going to change over time, so unfortunately this P won't have just 1 value. If you're new to calculating probabilities, this might feel like a bit much. Don't worry, it can take some time and practice for that kind of thing to sink in. But to summarize this, there are 2 ways for the sibling to also have the altruism allele. It can be identical by descent, or it can be from the other parent and just happen to be the altruism allele because there are copies floating around in the population. The fact that P depends on the frequency of the altruism allele is a little bit icky. But we can still say some things about the starting case and the best case and the worst case. First, we're going to start the simulation with 50% of each allele. So the probability P will start at 75% or 0.75. If we plug that into the expected value equation, we get 0.5. That's positive, so we should expect the altruism allele to do well at the beginning, increasing its frequency, causing P to go up more as time goes on, again raising the expected value, and so on, leading to total domination, which is the best case. And even in the worst case, the frequency of the altruism allele can't go any lower than 0, so P can never go below 0.5, meaning the expected value of the behavior can't go below 0. It's technically possible for the altruism allele to go extinct anyway, but there can literally never be a negative expected value for the behavior, so it would be very surprising. So my money is on the altruism allele taking over again. What do you think? If you think there's a flaw in this reasoning, now would be your chance to point it out. A hindsight explanation isn't worth as many points as a prediction. But why am I saying this? My prediction is obviously logical and flawless, and I'd never make a mistake, let alone put it on YouTube. Well, that's got to be a fluke, so again, let's run it a bunch of times and look at the average result to wash away that bad luck. All right, you caught me. There's something wrong with that previous analysis. And don't worry, I've checked the code. It's the prediction that's wrong, not just the simulation. I know I said hindsight explanations aren't worth as much, but if I'm being honest, it's what I had to do. And there's nothing wrong with understanding something in hindsight as long as you test that understanding in new situations to make sure it holds up. Anyway, take a minute to see if you can figure out the flaw. You might have noticed that the only difference between our calculation and Hamilton's rule is that Hamilton's rule uses this letter R instead of P. If you're like me, you originally assumed that R and P are just different labels for the same thing. R stands for relatedness, and it's not the probability that another creature shares the allele in question. That's P. R is the probability that another creature's allele is identical by descent. And if it's not obvious to you how that makes everything fall into place, you're not alone. But we'll get there. This is a competitive environment where the total population size is capped by the number of available homes. An allele succeeds in a competitive environment when its frequency increases over time, when it becomes a greater and greater fraction of the alleles in a population. Alleles can only make progress at the expense of other alleles, so to make a good prediction, we'd have to consider that competition more carefully instead of just focusing on the number of copies of the altruism allele. If the population starts out half and half, we can increase the frequency of the orange alleles by adding a group of alleles that's more than half orange. It's okay if we add some blue ones too, as long as more than half are orange. And if the population gets to a point where, say, 90% of the alleles are orange, then adding more than half orange won't be good enough. We'd have to add a group that's more than 90% orange. Ideally, 100% of the alleles we add would be orange, but unfortunately, we don't have a way to guarantee that. But as long as the fraction of orange alleles we add is more than the current frequency of orange alleles, the frequency will go up. So this is the true task of the altruistic behavior. On average, of the alleles it saves, the fraction that are orange needs to be greater than the current frequency of orange being the altruism allele. It's possible to write this down in a little bit more detail and do some algebra, and then Hamilton's rule pops out. We're not going to do that right now, but it happens in a way I didn't expect when I tried it, so it might be an interesting puzzle if you're curious about it. But at least for me, it's more intuitive to examine our misguided expected value calculation from before. The key difference is this second part of our expression for P. It deals with saved alleles that are not identical by descent. This group of alleles has the same makeup as those in the broader population, so you can help this group as much as you want, but on average that won't affect the frequency. Our original calculation only ignored the cowardly alleles, so it had a lopsided view. The remaining part of T deals with the siblings whose alleles are identical by descent. And this group, since it's 100% altruism alleles, will have an effect on the frequency if you add them to the pool. And this is actually just the same thing as R that appears in Hamilton's rule. For siblings, R is 1/2, like we worked out before when we thought about where the alleles
Exatamente
go,
no horário que eu
and
prometi.
each kind of relationship has its own value. And you can calculate R for any given situation by tracing where the alleles might go. But we're not going to get into that right now. So Hamilton's rule includes the effect on alleles that are identical by descent, which affects the frequency, and it includes the cost to the altruism allele, which also affects the frequency, but it ignores the group that's not identical by descent because that won't affect the frequency. It still feels a little bit magical to me that it looks like a plain expected value condition, but it neatly ignores everything that's neutral with respect to the current frequencies. If we
Não sabia que dá pra jogar.
Oi?
Não sabia que tinha modo solo.
Não tem.
Eu tô com. Tô jogando online, só que sem ninguém junto.
Tipo, sim.
Quanto que tá o teu compra? Eu jogo com você.
Não lembro.
Deixa eu dar uma olhada.
Mas
Não chamo o Enzo,
se
Enzo
quiser-
não pode.
Mas se você quiser, eu consto.
Não, eu vou dar uma olhada no preço, calma aí.
Tô seguindo os exemplos do nosso sábio senhor, mestre dos magos, e largar o LOL.
Não é nada ruim largar o League of Legends, não. Inclusive gostaria.
Eu não lembro quanto tá, eu tô pensando.
Eu tô bem na Steam, peraí, eu preciso tirar minha camisa porque tá muito calor.
Por favor, mande foto.
Ok.
Nossa.
É.
Ninguém joga esse jogo solo, então a dificuldade de jogar sozinho é muito subestimada, tá?
Ah, imagina. É de terror isso?
Mais ou menos. Eu gosto do tema, porque ele te dá uns sustos, tá ligado? Ele é meio de terror. Só que ao mesmo tempo ele é muito zen, tá ligado? Quando você joga.
É tipo Dead by Daylight.
Eu nunca joguei, mas eu...
Não é muito. A Dead by Daylight ele não dá muito medo, mas ele é. Mas ele tem seus sustos e.
deve ser isso aí. Eu acho que é isso aí.
33. 33 é de bem. Não, agora.
Eu joguei muito.
Pico Park tá em promoção.
Que tem produção.
Pico Park.
Meu Deus. Tô fechando aqui.
Sabe o que é o Pico Park?
Não faço ideia.
Acabou.
Você falou alguma
Pico
coisa?
Park. Você morreu?
Não, eu só fechei a atenção. Tô abrindo louco.
Ah,
A não ser que você vá comprar o jogo.
não, 33 não. Pera aí, eu vou mandar mensagem pro Enzo perguntando se esse Pico Park aqui é interessante.
Ah, é esse jogo.